Hello, dear students. Welcome to this course. Let me first briefly introduce myself. My name is Zainab. I got my bachelor and master in field of information technology in Iran. Then I pursued my PhD studies here in Sweden at Linköping University. So in this course, as you know, we are going to talk about information technology, challenges, and opportunities. So if I want to summarize what we're going to discuss about, I should tell you that first we are going to tell you how computers were created. So we will talk essentially about history of computers. Afterwards, we are going to talk about how computers work. For example, we have a lecture about computer architecture, which is basically the hardware of the computer. And then we will talk about the operating system, which is the main software that the computer needs to be operating. And then we will, of course, talk about how internet works, how computer networks operate in general. And we, of course, need to know about computer programming. Computer programming comes in different levels. We have programming in low level, which means it is basically closer to the computer hardware. So we will talk about assembly programming, and we have more high-level programs. One of them that is very trendy nowadays is Python. So we will have a lecture about Python programming. And after all these, we will talk about IT security, ethics in IT, and at the end, we will talk about nowadays trends in the computing world, such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. So our course consists of 9 lectures, 9 modules, and in each module you will have assignments to do, but don't worry. I know that this course is very broad. It is going to cover many areas of computing, but we don't go to too much of detail in any field, and you don't need to be expert in all these fields. The idea is to give you a wide range of information to know how computers are working and how they are affecting our life today. So feel free to ask your questions in our forum on Studium, and also feel free to email me and the course assistants via Studium. You can easily do that. So in the first lecture, we are going to talk about history of computers. Our objectives are to discover age of computers. How old do you think computers are? We are going to talk about implications of computers on our history. For example, in the beginning, computers were used, basically modern computers were used only in military and in some wars, but later on we had personal computers. We are going to talk about this. And we are, of course, going to talk about different inventions to the computers and the people who made those inventions. So how old do you think computers are? 30, 50 years old, 100 or more? But before we answer this question, let's start by talking about computers. What is a computer really? So a computer, if we want to say it very briefly, is an information system. An information system is a system of systems. It means that it consists of several subsystems. It takes as input raw data, and then it processes them and gives us information. So raw data is not processed, but when it is processed, it is called information. The most important part of an information system are people who are going to use this information. So here you see a picture that shows what is a system of systems. As you see, it consists of several subsystems, and then they interact with each other in many different ways, and they give data to each other and get data from each other. Before we talk about the history of computer, let me first introduce Moore's law. Moore's law is used very often in the computing world. Moore was actually a co-founder of Intel company. He introduced in 1965 his law, which proposed that the number of transistors on a microchip doubles every 2 years. Although, so this basically means that the size of the processor of a computer gets about half in every 2 years. And this basically also means that the cost of computers gets reduced. It is interesting that about 60 years has passed since his claim, and this rule still holds. It is even what happens in reality, it is even more than his rule, so it gets more than double the number of transistors. And his law was not obtained by empirical studies. It was based on observing the historical trend in technology. So here comes a diagram that tries to summarize the growth of technology over time. As you see here, in the old times, there was quite a long time between different inventions. But as we come closer to modern times, the inventions are happening very closely, and we might have several inventions in a single year, which was totally unbelievable in the old times. So Moore looked at this trend at his time and suggested his law, which still holds. So now let's talk about several people that affected computers long before the modern computers even existed. One of these people was Pascal. He created a machine called the Pascaline calculator, which was a calculator that was totally mechanical. It was built of wood and metal, and it had gears to count by 10. It could add, subtract, multiply, and divide. It is very interesting that his calculator remained in use for about 300 years and was the best of his time. Imagine that something is invented today and is the best of its time for like 300 years. It's not even imaginable for us today, but at those times, the inventions did not happen so often. There is also another invention which directly affected the production of new computers, modern computers, and it was the invention of the Jacquard loom. It was a machine that revolutionized fabric industry. So it was in old times, it was very difficult to define the patterns on fabric and weave them in fabrics. But this machine actually automatized that. It used punch cards that define the pattern that is going to be weaved, and then the machine weaves based on these punch cards. So it is very interesting to know that the punch cards, the concept of punch cards for giving data and storing data was used later on in computers. Here I want to introduce to you the first computer programmer. He actually lived not in 20th century, but in early 19th century. So as you see, when she lived, there were no computers. So she was a mathematician and gave the idea of computing, programming, and gave the idea that computers should use symbols, variables, etc., instead of the actual numbers. Ada Lovelace, the world's first programmer, worked very closely with Charles Babbage. They together built the Babbage engine, which was designed mainly by Charles Babbage. It was the first automatic calculator. And this machine was never developed. Babbage only drew his ideas and gave the basic description of this machine, but it was later on developed. So this machine that you see in this video was not developed in his time. It was developed later. It is very interesting that his machine gave the idea for creation of nowadays computers, and it is very similar to the design of nowadays computers. Another very important historic person in the history of computers is Herman Hollerith. He created the Hollerith tabulating machine. His work was actually in the US Census Office. So he was responsible for collecting census information such as the number of households, the number of goats each household had, the number of sheep, etc., etc. And then their job was to summarize this information, do statistical studies on it, and get tax from taxpayers and so on. So he felt that doing all this work by hand is just very time consuming. So what he did was to make a machine that used punch cards again. It's very interesting that punch cards are used a lot. So he used punch cards to collect information in them, and he actually did a great breakthrough. So the job that was supposed to take for like 10 years with his machine took only 3 months, and it saved several $million in total for the taxpayers at his time. He later on founded a company which later became the IBM company that now produces the processors for the computers. So another person which we should of course introduce now here is Alan Turing. Alan Turing lived in 20th century. He introduced the Turing machine. Again, he gave only the basic idea, the abstract idea. He didn't build the machine in his time, but it was produced later on. So in this machine, as you see, we have a tape which serves as the as something like the RAM that we have in computers nowadays. So it stores the data which is input to the computer and the instructions as well. It can be written to, read from, and it can also be erased. So here you see this is the eraser. It can erase some of the zeros and ones that is written here. So this machine is the idea of this machine is used very often in the world of computers today. And there was also a movie about him that was produced in 2014. It was called The Imitation Game, and it talked about not the invention of the Turing machine, but it talked about the role of Alan Turing in the World War II when he tried to decode the messages that were encoded and sent from the Germans to the British government. Now that we have discovered some of the people and the machines before the modern computers, let's now discuss the computers of modern age. When we talk about history of computers of modern age, we usually divide this history to 5 generations. These generations differ from each other in terms of the electronic device that is used mainly in those computers, and in terms of their capacity, speed, power consumption, input and output devices, and memory, etc. So in the first generation, vacuum tubes were used, and this lasted from the 1940s to 1950s. We will talk in more detail about these generations in the coming slides. So you see here a vacuum tube. They were nearly the size of a small soda can. In the second generation, transistors were used. You see here a transistor, but transistors, it's not shown very well here, but transistors are much smaller than vacuum tubes. In the third generation, integrated circuits were used. Integrated circuits are basically a collection of several hundreds to thousands of transistors. In the uh, first generation, we have microprocessors, which use like thousands of transistors. In the fifth generation, we have ultra large scale integration. It is called sometimes the age of artificial intelligence. Both fourth and fifth generation last to our present time. So in the first generation, vacuum tubes were the main electronic component of computers. A vacuum tube is a device that controls electric current flow in a high vacuum. So it consists of several electrodes, and an electric potential difference is applied to it. In the first generation, the main electronic component was magnetic tubes, which was in size almost as big as a small soda can. The main memory in those computers was magnetic drums and magnetic tapes, and the programming language was very low level at the time. It was machine language. So machine language is very close to the language that the computer is the language actually that the computer hardware understands. Nowadays, we use more high-level languages that are understandable to humans. They are not understandable by computer hardware directly. Computers of this generation consumed a lot of power because vacuum tubes need a lot of electricity, and as a result, they generated a lot of heat. And because vacuum tubes are very big, and those computers were also very big, so they occupy the whole room, if not the whole building, for the computer itself and for the cooling system of it. And as input and output devices, they used punch cards and paper tape. It's very interesting that they are using the punch cards that were used once in the fabric industry. And it's interesting to know that there were only about 100 of those computers in total being produced. One of the main computers in this era was called ENIAC. It was an all-electronic numerical calculator. So previous calculators, as you saw, were mechanical, and later on it were both mechanical and electronic, but this one is totally electronic. But it was still very big and clumsy. It consists of about 18,000 vacuum cubes. So you see this vacuum tubes. You see that these vacuum tubes are connected together with switches and wires, and how big the whole machine is. It actually filled a very big space of 1,800 square feet. One of the leading persons in this era whose ideas affected the computers even today was called John von Neumann. In 1945, he outlined the architecture of a modern computer. It was a stored program computer. Before his ideas, computers didn't store the program or instructions inside. They were given to them as input. But in his new architecture, the programs were stored inside the computer, and he used the same memory to store both data and the program. And his idea eliminated the need for clumsy methods of programming, such as punch cards. And it led to invention of a machine called EDVAC, which you see in this picture he's standing beside. And it was the first stored program computer. There was another computer in this era which was called UNIVAC. So you see at this generation, we don't have any personal computers, or computers that are generated are basically used more in military, or they are used for scientific reasons, for scientific research, etc. But we are taking the steps gradually to come to the personal computers. So at 1951, UNIVAC was manufactured, which UNIVAC stands for Universal Automatic Computer. It was the first commercially successful digital computer. UNIVAC operated on magnetic tapes, not punch cards anymore. And it was the last computer to use vacuum tubes. After this point, transistors were used. So transistors were invented at 1945 at Bell Laboratories. Here you see a vacuum tube and a transistor, and you can see how they compare to each other in size. Transistors were much smaller than vacuum tubes, and they consumed less energy, which was good news for computers. A transistor is a semiconductor device that amplifies or switches electronic signals and electrical power. Here is a graphical schema of a transistor. It has 3 terminals. Number 1 here, which is called collector, is the input. Number 2, which is base, is some sort of controller. And the number 3 is the emitter or the output of the transistor. A transistor is like a water tap. You open it, you close the electrical flow to flow through it, and you close it, you shut down the water flow, or in this case, electric flow. So in the second generation, which was between 1950s and 1960s, the main electronic component was the transistors. And the memory that was used was magnetic tapes or magnetic disk. And the programming language is now assembly language, which is in a higher level than machine language. So because transistors were smaller than vacuum tubes, now the computers in this generation also became smaller and consumed less energy than the first generation. And it's interesting that they were also faster. As we go in the computer generations forward, we see that computers are both smaller and faster. The reason why they get faster is that when they are smaller, the data needs to go through a shorter path, so the computations become faster. So in the second generation, the input and output devices were punch cards and magnetic tapes. There were several computers manufactured at this generation. Some were manufactured at Bell Laboratories, for example, the Tradic machine, which is showed here, and IBM also created several computers at this generation. One of them is shown here. You see they are much smaller than the previous machines. So after the generation of transistors, the integrated circuits were invented at 1958. Integrated circuits are small chips that contain thousands of transistors. They enable computers to become even smaller than the second generation, and they are also lighter, of course. So this ICs gave rise to the third generation of computers. In the third generation, as we said earlier, the main electronic component was ICs. And as for memory, they used the magnetic tape, magnetic disk, and magnetic cores. The programming languages at this point is at a higher level. For example, BASIC and Pascal, COBOL, C, etc. were introduced at this age. And they are, of course, smaller in size and consume less energy. It's needless to say that they are faster than the previous generation. And their input and output devices have also evolved. So here we have the monitors, printers, keyboards being introduced and used. At 1971, the invention of microprocessors totally changed the world of computers. Microprocessors, as you see in this picture, are basically a single chip that consists of millions of transistors. So it was a huge advancement. It led to more compact computers. Intel and Motorola were the first manufacturers of microprocessors. So now we enter the fourth generation, which starts at 1971 and it continues until now. So as I said, the main electronic component was the microprocessors, which was a VLSI device. A VLSI stands for Very Large Scale Integration. The memory that is used at this generation in computers consists of two parts, RAM and ROM. RAM is the temporary memory, which is erased each time you turn off your computer, and ROM is the permanent memory. And we have more high-level programming languages, and we have smaller computers, which are at the same time faster. And the input and output devices consist of keyboards, monitors, pointing devices, even optical devices, etc. And it is interesting to know that networks were introduced at the fourth generation. In a network, we can connect two or more computers to exchange data and to cooperate with each other and do many sorts of things. Before this generation, the computers were not connectable. But we didn't have all these advancements in the beginning of this generation, of course. There was several inventions that led to all these outcomes that we have at this time. So let's go a little bit back in time and see the first personal computer. The first personal computer was called the Altair. Bill Gates was one of the first owners of it. This machine didn't have any keyboard or monitor, didn't have any stored program. You had to each time give it instructions. Each time you would turn it on, you needed to give it instructions. It is interesting that here we have the first computer game by Altair. As you see, of course, there is no graphical interface. You have to give instructions, and then the lights turn on and off based on the instructions that are given, and so then you can make your own computer game. There were other computers in this generation. One of the leading ones were Apple I and Apple II, which were built by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. They actually invented the notion of operating systems. Before this point, the programs were not stored on the computer, so there could not be any operating system. You had to program before this time. You had to program your computer each time you turned it on. But they actually introduced operating systems that were stored on the permanent memory or RAM. So then other computer programs could also be created afterwards. IBM introduced at 1981 its own personal computers that it called them PCs. PC, as you know, stands for personal computer, and it's a name used by IBM. And they were expensive, and but still they were huge advancements. So I think it was New York Times that called them the machine of the year. Interestingly, we have the first portable computer at this time as well. So at 1981, the machine called the Osborne was created, and it weighed a lot. It was 12 kilograms, and it had a very small screen of just 5 inches. And it didn't have any battery and any software, any installed software. So at the same time that hardware was evolving, software was also evolving. So at the hardware part, we had MIPS technology processors being introduced to the market. And we had also programming languages evolving from low level to high level. And we have operating systems being introduced and advancing. And because we had operating systems, then we could have application software. So then the machines became more and more powerful and useful for even everyday life. So the programming languages were evolved so that we could have coding. The programming became more doable for humans. In the first generation, if you remember, we had machine language, which is not really understandable for people. It is very difficult to understand what it means. But with the high-level languages, it is much easier to understand the programs and do programming. And then we have, as I said, operating systems that evolved during this time. And interestingly, the first programs in this generation were stored on audio cassettes, as you see here. But then later on, floppy disks were introduced and programs could be stored. So this gave rise to creation of application programs. Each operating system needs its own specific chip. So we had different chips for Apple computers, for IBM PCs. IBM PCs used Intel 8080 chips. And we had also Microsoft at this point that developed its own DOS program, MS-DOS, which was the used for IBM PCs as well, and it used Intel chips. So when the operating systems were invented and were stored, software applications could also be created. So at this point, we have explosion of application software that do many kind of things. And we have also graphical user interfaces being introduced at early 1980s. And so we have two important computers here, Apple Lisa and Apple Macintosh. Apple Macintosh cost much less than Lisa. And Lisa was the first one to have a graphical user interface. So as I said, in the first generation, the networks of computers was possible, that computers became connectable. So internet also was created in this generation in early 90s. And because we had internet, we needed to have browsers. The first browser that was introduced was called Mosaic. You can see a picture of it here. The next one, the next year was introduced, and it was called Netscape. And then in 1995, Microsoft Internet Explorer was introduced. So in the fifth generation of the computers, that is the current generation of the computers, we have gone beyond even microprocessors and VLSIs. Today we have ULSIs that consist of more transistors on a single chip, and we have the notion of parallel computing being introduced. In parallel computing, several instructions can be performed in the computer, so it can very much increase the speed of the computations of the computer. And languages that computers understand has also evolved a lot. Computers can nowadays understand human language. And of course, they have continued the previous trend in lowering the power consumption and being faster and smaller. And the input and output devices have also changed a lot. We have, besides the keyboards and monitors and printers, etc., we have now touch screens, speech input, that can be processed by the computer. So thank you for your attention to this lecture. Feel free to ask your questions by email or in the forum on Studium. You will have an assignment to do for this lecture. Good luck.